Record, and apparently also had a job at STV Local for a little while. And tonight we're doing just a little bit of a debate on the back of what Paul was talking about. We've always planned to debate anyway, and obviously things over the last couple of weeks have kind of got a bit mental with Johan Harry, the Sun in the Mirror up for contempt, news of the world obviously today, the record job's about to go. There's a lot of stories affecting the media, especially up here. So the idea is really we're just going to go around and Kevin will be going around among you if you've got a point to raise, talking about what the biggest problems are, what people have identified as the problems affecting Scottish media is, because you guys are the grassroots of the industry, you guys are the ones who are most affected by it, and too often that's the voices that aren't heard. Too often when you hear about discussions about the bin lorry outside, too often when you hear discussions about the media, it's all professors and pundits and guys who had a cup of coffee with the industry once 20 years ago who think they know how to solve everything. And they don't. It's you guys who are really the sort of the core of the industry for the next 20, 30 years who are going to be most affected by what happens now. So it's a chance for you to really sort of air your grievances, air your views, talk about the issues that you've identified in the front line and what we do to fix them. You know, how do we work together? How do we save Scottish journalism, if we can save it? We've got obviously a couple of special guests with us. Paul's here. It's Stuart Kirkpatrick, I don't know if you know it, editor of the Caledonian Mercury, Scotland's first digital newspaper editor. There'll be a print edition coming Wednesday.
Very. Yes.
And I'm sure they'll chip in as well as we go along. But so then I want to kick off with the single biggest issue that they think affects Scottish journalism. Anyone?
Yeah, can I, by show of hands, how many people have a full-time, well-paid job for a newspaper or broadcaster or magazine?
Define well paid.
Well paid over £25,000 a year. Well, that's the biggest problem with Scottish journalism. Yeah, in that, you know, I run. I'm not. Yes. Congratulations, by the way. Well done. Basically, we're round of applause.
The drinks are on you.
But that's the problem. Is there? You know, that's how I'm able to run an online newspaper, because it's a vast amount. A modest, a share of will be launched in the print edition very. But the biggest problem is there's a vast amount of talent in Scotland. There's always been one world-class London national equivalent newsroom in Scotland distributed amongst the titles up here. There's a huge amount of talented journalists, there's a huge amount of talented thinkers, there's a huge amount of media entrepreneurs in Scotland, and there isn't a vehicle for them. I was thinking how ironic it was when Paul was talking that the NUJ Scottish organiser had a better handle on the facts of running a business than the people who run Scotland's media businesses, and he does. I was thinking back to my time before I went into digital, before 2000, at how much a specialist would be paid at the Scotsman, and it was about £50,000 a year. And in real terms, there's been a fall in salaries, a dramatic deflation of at least £10,000 since I left newspapers. Those are the biggest problems, and if I had to nail it to the floor, the problem is the businesses we are looking for work from. And the answer is either those businesses are saved, changed, dragged, kicking and screaming into first the 20th and then the 21st centuries, or we do it ourselves.
Can I raise a point about what Stuart was saying about doing it ourselves then? Given the age that we live in, you've got the whole citizen journalism thing. They say anyone can be a journalist given a camera, phone and a blog, which I don't subscribe to myself, but I think there's evidence of it in this room. I mean, Stuart, I know that when you set up the Caledonian Mercury, it's knowing that kind of side of the technology, I know that it costs a lot less to set up online than people might think. I've personally set up 2 sites, Geek Chocolate and Planet Hollywood with Alistair. Ian and Craig, I know you guys have got the Thumbcast, so the technology is available to everyone. And are the big boys seeing that? Are they saying, well, hang on a minute, if anyone can do this, why should we pay specialists, guys who have trained to come in and do this for us at, you know, at a salaried rate? Is that an issue?
That's a really good question. Who have we got here that works for a digital publisher other than sort of Stuart and myself? Is there anyone in here who works on a predominantly digital platform? Jamie, I know, does. Jamie, do you want to see any views on that?
Mike?
That's the mic. We're going to have to take tons of this. I'm a community editor at STV Local. I cover the original pilot in North Lanarkshire. I'm still doing Motherwell and Wiltshire sites, and I came from Local Weekly from Clydebank Post. At the Clydebank Post, we had absolutely no idea how to handle the internet. We were given nothing. One person who uploaded little bits of stories every week. And we had no idea if that was actually helping or not. We just thought it's a website and we should be using it because people are still looking for news online. But the only other thing that we were ever judged on was circulation, which fell the entire time we were there across all but one title, actually, to be fair. The Barton Reporter actually increased at that time because I think it was taking readers from the Hunting's Herald. Well, I went to STV Local, and then we were still working in the same patches that Local News was working. We were basically going to cover the same stories. We wanted to tap into the same mindset of what people were looking for, but we were also looking to take in a different news agenda, and we were also looking to use that citizen journalism thing. Now, we were brought in as professionals, as qualified people doing that, but we are still wanting to encourage people to use us as a sort of an in-betweener. So they will have the news, they'll maybe want to write the news, but we can put a sheen on it. We can facilitate them. A lot of people are maybe they're either going out there and they're writing what they want to write, and they're doing so without enough of a grasp on how much of the facts they need to be getting out there. And in that respect, it's great because we're going out and we're helping people to achieve this ideal of citizen journalism, which is built up because of the internet. But we're also using the skills that you would need in any newsroom that over the last few decades as well. I mean, I don't know what outward perceptions are. I've only heard from people who maybe looked at it, but it'd be interesting to hear as well whether people in the room think that there's a balance being struck with it. I don't know how much people even know about it. It's not reached their area yet. But certainly that's the angle that we're taking from inside the STV newsroom at the moment.
Well, Jimmy raises an interesting point. One is with the citizen journalism thing, also counts something as well. Is part of the problem that we're still too focused as an industry on traditional tropes? Do we need to look more at how we evolve journalism as an industry? You know, in Scotland, we're a small country. We've got, you know, a small population, but we've got a lot of media within that population. Is perhaps the problem that we don't use that media to communicate with the community and engage with the community properly, and have the community engage with us properly. Anyone got any views?
I think the amount of outlets and titles in Scotland is reflective of something in the Scottish personality and the kind of breadth of types of people that you meet in Scotland, and there's almost like, you may say there's a title for everybody to an extent, but I think it has been devalued hugely. I don't know if that's going to make any difference. No. Sorry, I think the point earlier about all these titles have been really devalued and they're really kind of run out of boundaries. I think people still really do cherish their newspapers. I mean, I work with the Renfrewshire Gazette, and I know just through talking to people that they really appreciate having a local newspaper which covers stuff in their area which does not get covered anywhere else. And there's a difference between reading something on a website and actually seeing it there in the paper. Like, it's a solid, tangible thing. And there's still something very magical about that, and I think many outlets and many are failing to realise how important that is. And I think that's the challenge for print media, is to embrace that. And I think you can't replicate that online. There is absolutely a need and a kind of a market for online stuff at the hyper-local level, but I think that there's really, titles are really missing how much people appreciate it, and they're really missing that point and allowing themselves to slide into mediocrity to an extent. So
that's an interesting point Martin raises. I mean, there is obviously this continual, we're told that digital was the future, that everything should be online. You know, we've seen, obviously, Stuart is living proof of digital being the way that people want to go, but we don't have a particularly digital culture in Scotland. We don't have great broadband distribution. We don't have the infrastructure in many ways to do it. Are we perhaps trying to run before we come out? Are we putting too much emphasis on digital before we should, you know, focus on getting the print side tidied up?
Do we exchange that? What I wanted to say is, well, obviously I'm half Swiss, so I come from a small country as well, and Switzerland is definitely not digital at all. But newspapers are doing fairly well in Switzerland, and it is, I think there's a difference there, because with the fact that you have 3 languages in Switzerland, everything has to be local. Everything has to be local to the German part, the French part, or the Italian part. And that seems to work really well. I mean, whenever I'm back home, I don't hear any issues with newspapers or any big kind of cuts going on. Obviously, there must be some that I'm not aware of, but at the same time, the industry seems to be going quite well. There's a plethora of media in Switzerland, from TV stations, radios, newspapers covering everything from local to national news. So yeah, I think if you kind of cut it back to the local areas and try to cover the national stories on a local level, that seems to work really well. I mean, again, it's probably because we have the 3 languages that, you know, you need to do that anyway, because you can't exactly have one national TV station that gives you a bulletin in 3 different languages. But that does seem to facilitate, I think, the kind of, I want to say procreation, but that's obviously not that I want. But you know, it does seem to facilitate, you know, a kind of
proliferation.
Proliferation, thank you, of media across the country. So, you know, I think that might be a good way to go, to try and tackle the national on a local level a lot.
Well, there is,
more.
of course, a Scottish analogy to that, which is 2 largest papers, effectively, or broadsheet papers in Scotland, which have managed their decline the most, which is the Press and Journal and the Courier, who have both managed to sustain their circulation and deflect a lot of the circulation drop that their equivalents in Edinburgh and Glasgow have had, the Scotsman and the Herald, and they have virtually no online presence. Is there something, a lesson we need to learn from that, or is it just because they are up north? Is there a lesson from that? Great.
I would say in part that, and you know this from your time up there, Ian, that in part that Dundee and Aberdeen, pretty much past Stirling, they consider themselves more abandoned by the Central Belt, and they've always been more loyal to their local editions. I mean, it's the same to an extent if you go to the Courier in Inverness. And I think there's not been that loyalty in the Central Belt, which also ties into the other point of, you know, that there are very few other countries which have had to deal with a foreign invasion as such. And I don't mean that as a dig to the Daily Mail and the Express and the Star, but in essence, you know, between those 3 alone, that's 200,000 sales a day that have came from, you know, other titles. You know, most people buy the Mail, you know, I think it's still around about 120,000 a day as their sole newspaper. You know, they're no longer buying the Record, they're perhaps not buying the Sun, which I would now consider indigenous because of the editorial staff it's got. You know, it's fairly beefed up from its days of, you know, 5 men round a desk and 2 sports reporters. But, you know, that's also got to be an issue. And, you know, you rightly talk about online there, but also, you know, for the younger guys in here, you know, when the magazines are all produced down south, when everything is done in down south, if you want to be a good journalist, you know, there's got to be an element of pressure on them to think, well, if I actually want to be good at this, if I want to be as good as I can be, to have to go down south, which again doesn't help Scottish journalism, which begs is the question, the fact that there's no Scottish owners of the Scottish press.
Well, that's a key question, and obviously Paul raised that as well. Paul, you've got to come on that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubts about the impact of the English income, but I want to talk about the thing you were talking about the crowdsourcing, as it's called, citizen journalism. If you look on the Gannett website, on their home website, which they're the owners of NewsQuest, who own the Herald Evening Times, Sunday Herald, you'll track back to a mission statement by their chief executive, who says, inevitably we will move more and more towards crowdsourcing, and we will use members of the public, and we'll go to women's groups, and we'll use families and young football groups and sports clubs, and they will take the place of journalists, and it will cost us nothing, right? And we will be community based, and that is the future, and that's their future, and that's backed up by newspapers closing. Our role and the position that we've tried to take is to say they don't need to be, there doesn't need to be that conflict, just as you said there about engaging with the community. I had a meeting yesterday with the owner of the Government Free Press, and that's his concept. You know, I'm a South Sider, I'm born and grew up and live in Glasgow, South Side. He says, you know, I will take advertising, but I will take stories about what's going on in the community, and I will engage with them. And he was telling about the growth within a very short time and the amount of advertising that was attracting just by being identified as being part of the community. And yet they take copy from local people and photographs handed in if they're of quality. But the whole question is the quality. How do you maintain that quality? Because if you don't, it deteriorates and diminishes. If it, however, you get a certain amount of quality and interesting stories, you can then build on that. And one of the things I was discussing with him was, how does he then grow? And he'd had meetings with a couple of guys in the record who were facing losing their jobs. And we were talking about whether they could get shifts with him, and they could do a bit of work with him and grow the paper even more. And he then said to them, what about setting up a similar title in the West End of Glasgow, see if we can have a mirror image there, we can grow from there, get another 2 or 3 people employed there. I was advising them on the whole question of going cooperative, getting charitable status if you're a community paper, getting tax and rates relief. So it's a constructive growth, still community based, still reflecting journalistic ethics and standards and reflecting what's going on in the community, but also generating an income as well, because it's not just about amateurism, it's about breaking away from that, and particularly younger people trying to break into the industry. You need to make a living. Okay, you can get all the creativity you want out of writing an interesting blog and getting stuff published and things like that. It's quite gratifying, but at some stage you then have to say, where does my income come from here? And the Scottish Government are very keen to build on this and to look at models to say, we want investment, we want to put things in place, and we're discussing a big range of things, a wide range of things with them, including buyouts of some of the bigger papers, right? With major entrepreneurs, Scottish philanthropic millionaires who are saying, we don't like what's happening here, and we're advising them on investment and what the returns would be and things like that. They've seen a decline, and their view was the industry's going downhill and they're not making any money. We've then gone back and said, no, here's the money they're making, here's the money they're still making. And they were quite impressed with the money that's still there to be generated. And I think that this myth about this downward spiral is because they're not making enough profits. But the other thing I was saying to Ian before the break, what's disappointed me more than anything is where we've argued with employers to take on additional staff to run their own websites and to run them parallel with the papers and to complement them, not to go in conflict with them. A number of them tried that on an experimental basis. And things like the Hannah News and the Inverness Courier, they set up their own hub. The Record have developed their website, a number of other initiatives. The Scotsman was probably the first, which could have been a big success. And the quality level there, without conflicting with the papers, was held up as an example of the way forward. Bizarrely, they've all backed off. They've all, Trinity Mirror, the same in the weekly newspapers, they set up an online hub in Inverness and in Trinity Mirror and the Scotsman. All those people have either left or been absorbed into the papers. And you have to ask why. They've not the courage of the convictions, because they're not making enough money fast enough for them. What is their lack of courage to say, this is technological development, let's make the most of it. Let's get younger people who have video journalism skills, web skills, get them into the community and start building the bridges there. Not just with news, but also advertising. Say to local companies, look, we are a genuine local product. So all those things need to be taken into consideration. And I just put it down to mismanagement. I deal with almost every managing director in the country, and when you have discussions like this, and even with politicians and them, they eventually agree, but they don't do it.
Yeah.
You know, someone's stopping it, and I think a lot of the blocks are coming from down south. I really do think there's a lack of awareness of what the potential in Scotland is, and I think that's part of the problem.
Can I ask a very quick question first before Stuart comes in? It ties into what Paul just said, and also Stuart's straw poll from the start. Of all the guys who put their hands up at the start, so they're not in, or didn't put their hands up, sorry, so they're not in full-time, well-paid jobs and on, who anticipates being within the next 2 years? Well, those who are already in, and those who are not already in full-time, well-paid jobs, who anticipates being in a well-paid full-time job in journalism within the next 2 years? 1, 2, 3. Well-paid. That's.
Yeah.
Okay. Alright, let me open now then. Who anticipates being in a full-time editorial job within the next 2 years? Really? That's a lot more than I thought, actually. Right, pick one of you. Sorry, let's go at the back. Why do you think I've been there in 2 years?
Because my job's not.
Because that holds the stuff.
No, I work for VIP Solutions, a procurement company with a media base, and they produce a couple of magazines and websites, and what I do is the subscribed news. So that's news that is paid for, so that we are making money, but it's privately held, it's not public, it's social journalism. But that's why, because it's business journalism and it's a slightly different market which does have money.
Yeah. Oh, let me flip around. Anyone else who's working for what you could call the indigenous press or mainstream press within the next 2 years in a decent job?
To be fair, there's nothing.
So, you're Alan.
Well, I'm an optimist, so yes. Thank you. No, I'm actually a casual at the Sunday Mail, so I've seen sort of first hand what's going on in there. But yeah, I'm an optimist. I'm not going to give up yet, anyway. So I think if you show that you've got the potential, and if you show you've got the initiative, then one day, depending on how long it's going to take, hopefully something will open up.
That optimism thing, I'm kind of the same. Talk slowly until the microphone gets.
In your own time.
I'm also, an optimist about it. I really think I will be in a decent paid job in the next couple of years, because it takes everybody in the industry to be optimistic about it. Whether that becomes, for example, 100 wannabe journalists banding together to build a press association, to come up with a newswire or something like that. It's one of those things that it's that kind of optimism that I think is going to keep it going. Martin brought up the point about citizen journalism earlier on. I think citizen journalism is probably the most important and probably the biggest change to the industry that's happened in the last 10 years, because all of a sudden, and we've all done it, we all see things go, look at that, take a picture. For example, there was the plane crashing in Hudson River a few years ago. We first heard about that on Twitter.
Yeah.
And the images of that came from a security camera that was on a building on the river. And the only reason we know about that is because of these alternative media. It was the same with Mumbai terrorism at the hotel in 2007. That came out through Twitter. The images, most of the images that we got initially before the news crews got there, came from mobile phones. So I think that is the most important thing. It's actually kind of encouraging people to do that. The only difference is between, say, for example, us and the citizen journalist is we maybe have a certain amount of news sense, a certain amount of being able to do things like balance that the kid in the street, which a lot of them are, don't necessarily have. For example, if there's a big roaring fire which happened at the oil refinery a few years ago, BBC journalist down there, doing his piece to camera, and the kids coming up to him and saying, "Are these pictures any good?" And they say, "No, we can't use them." So these kids are running off, getting closer to the fire to try and get better pictures. And again, it was the same with the Mumbai thing. The first images of the terrorists were of a crappy mobile phone image being sent to Sky News. Yeah. And the thing that I noticed most about that was the anchor didn't have a clue what she was looking at. It was a terrible picture, but it was the only one, so we were using it. And I think it's just encouraging people to be optimistic about journalism as a whole. And for example, you sort of did your poll there saying who thinks they're going to be in a decent paid job in the next 2 years. I think we all can be, if we're optimistic and kind of think slightly more sideways about the industry and almost, not forgetting about the traditional media, but kind of realising that it's had its day, I think. For example, there are a lot of newspaper websites which just don't use them properly. Herald Scotland, beautiful website, crappy content. But then you've got Scotsman.com, ugly website, but it's got great content. So you're...
Stuart, any thoughts on that?
You've been generous about the content, but yeah.
Well, you know what I mean? It's just one of those things. Nobody's really kind of getting the right balance, but when they do, then it's going to be the domain of us and the people. I don't sound like a communist when I say that.
I think, comrade, you made a I mean, there's 2 points to take from it a lot, and I'm sure Pauline and Stuart would back this up as much. For all we talk about citizen journalism as being the future and very important, the one thing to remember, and this is based on watching the rise of digital, and despite my youthful looks, I'm nearly 40, so I've seen this come from no internet to where we are now. 99% of citizen journalists are only journalists in something that interests them. And to me, that's a huge difference between, to me, you're effectively a hobbyist, at best a lobbyist, because you're interested, the M74 road, where it goes, Edinburgh trams or what have you. You're not out, as any journalist in here has been, or I'm sure even the students on placement have done, the death knock or the sitting for 4 hours at the boring council meeting. These are the things that can have bigger impact in people's lives. So when people tell you it's going to be all about citizen journalism, it's not, because as Paul pointed out as much as MD, it's about, there's an issue of quality control. There's got the best-willed citizen journalist in the world can send you in 1,000 words and could probably bury the intro, round about the 800th word. It takes that skill and training to go, there's the story, not what they think, bang, rewrite. Don't even think it's fancy as making it nice for SEO, just taking the basic story and putting it into the format. So there will always be a market for professional journalists. The name will change. I mean, this is a thing I've found hilarious. I've seen Stuart, Paul and Ian, we've all been interviewed in this over the years, and it's what is the future of things online? It's the same as it was before, it's content. And I remember having an argument at the BBC when they're going, oh, journalism's screwed. I went, no, journalism's got a great future as content providers. And they were going, no, content providers are different from journalists. And I went, no, they're not. It's the exact same thing. But a lot of journalists just let themselves accept that mindset of, no, we're journalists, not content providers. Because the minute you think, I'm a content provider, you can monetize yourself. And I know for a lot of journalists who like the romantic old image, that's almost a nasty word, but that's the way to think of it. Journalists are used to low pay, long hours, and as many a hack that's jumped into PR, or even just writing for themselves by writing books or what have you, can tell you, your words have clout, your words have power, and ultimately your words can pay if you're of a professional standard. It's just the onus is now more on you as an individual than relying on a brand to make, you can't rely on The Guardian to make you big, the Daily Record to make you big. Sure shit, can't rely on the News of the World to make you big, unless you've got a really good scoop for this Sunday. But it's about you now and how much you keep going, and that means a lot of long hours grafting. Unfortunately, it's not a quick route to, even to a decent salary, but if you're a good journalist, you'll still get out there.
In that vein, has anyone sort of set up their own sort of, I don't say consultancy, but their own website, their own agency, or looked at the possibility of doing that, thinking, well, I'm not going to get a job full time, I might as well do my own thing? Has anyone here done that?
I can tell you what I do. I set up my own company 3 years ago. I was a producer on Newsnight and on Panorama at the BBC. I left the BBC 3 years ago and I set up my own company. I've always worked in television journalism, and I now work, I have a company called Firecrest Films. It's the only company, I think, in Britain that has an output deal with Channel 4 News. And I do investigations for Channel 4 News. And what I've found, I've lived in Scotland for 10 years, I've lived here in Glasgow, and I can't talk about digital, but I can talk about media as a consumer of media in Scotland. But what I find so frustrating is the mismatch between the stories here. There's such rich stories here, and yet the stories that you can actually read about. In that, certainly from a broadcast media perspective, you have, a news bulletin produced from London, whether on the BBC or on Channel 4 News, that's very geared towards English viewers. And then the opt-out news up here, which is obsessed with crime stories, that doesn't really reflect the stories that we all know are happening here and that we want to see. That I found most of the time that I watch Rep Scott, I'm shouting at the television because it's the same stories, the same targets over and over and over again. And what I find so frustrating is that this is a country which has the richest stories in terms of urban stories, rural stories, crime stories, poverty stories, stories about depopulation, stories about overpopulation. And there's so many stories that just never ever make. And I know that there's a lot in local papers. I find myself reading local papers obsessively because I find the national papers here, whether they're English-produced national papers or Scottish national papers, very, very frustrating because there's such a mismatch between what you know is going on and what you want to read.
So at the back, so you hand up as well, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's going to have to be rewind back a couple of
That's alright, go for it.
so that's all right, yeah. It's just going back to what the chap at the corner was saying there, sorry I didn't catch your name, about the content that's online, on, for example, the Herald website and the Scotsman website. I'm a student at Strathclyde University. We've got a visiting professor called Blair Jenkins, I'm sure from the BBC, his name will be known to most, if not all, in the room. And he was talking about, it was actually in response to one of my questions about the difference between something online like they have in like the Guardian website and pretty much every other broadsheets online forum, their own website, and that the Guardian essentially are operating at a different level whereby they don't just simply reproduce the content that they put in the daily edition. And I think that that's something that the Herald and Scotsman are particularly guilty of. There's no difference between what goes out on the morning and what's put up on the website the night before. And I think we're all at a stage now where we can all say that we're ready to do a wee bit better than that. Particularly young journalists come through with a knowledge of digital media and that sort of thing. But crucially, and this ties in with what the chap over there is saying, it can't just be anyone. You need that quality control. But I think there's a real gap for something like the Herald or the Scotsman website, but that is not just a simple recreation of what they put out daily. More interactive stuff, more video, things like that. I think that's the main way that things can really move forward.
I think, and I'll jump in, I didn't expect you to stick up for the Guardian. I think the problem with using the Guardian as a role model, and perhaps Blair as well to an extent, who's been a fantastic journalist throughout the years, is that a lot of Blair's time as a journalist and through the ranks has been in the BBC, which has never struggled for cash. Yes. And at the Guardian, you'll know better than me, what's their loss this week to the penny?
£37 million operating loss for the first 6 months of this year, £171 million loss last year.
So in other words, they're pissing a lot of money against the wall. Yeah. And that's great when you're the Scott Trust, as the Guardian can do, and the Guardian gets rid of everybody, sells off flagship titles to preserve the Guardian. The BBC, as I'm saying, with the best, and fair play, hasn't had the funding crisis. The Herald, the Scotsman, the Record, everyone else out with those two titles doesn't have the luxury that they have. They have to balance somehow. And unfortunately, in this age of bean counters running the show, the quick way of doing that, and as Paul points out, it's not even to minimise loss, it's just to try and preserve profit, is let's get a bunch of bodies out the door, let's buy a website as a quick fix, which 9 times out of 10 actually makes the problem worse. And that to me is the biggest problem in all of this. For everyone goes, it's journalism's failure. to me it's a failure of the marketing departments, of the advertising teams that turn up and treat, they say to you, a banner ad's the next big thing. They think that's Huawei and shit hot, and can you give us 15 grand for a banner ad in the Record? This is what the problem is. The papers, as a culture, haven't moved forward. Never mind the reporters being hostile to online. The rest of the teams didn't see it either and haven't embraced it. And that's where I think the problem is. People go, the Guardian's great at it, and there's no denying the Guardian has a lot of fantastic comment. The Guardian's done some great things. The great tale I always have is when they were setting up their podcast studio, the guy who was tasked with it was told there's no budget, and he took that to mean that there's absolutely no cash. So he went out and got pretty much, half a dozen eggshell boxes and a bunch of cheap kit for about 250 quid, went back and said, in true journalist style, he just get down with it and went, there's your studio, and they were aghast. They were like, no, dear boy, when we said there's no budget, we meant go for it. So suddenly they had this studio that was, cost thousands, and was comparable with anything Radio 1 had, and fair play. But the problem being, when you quote the Guardian or the BBC, you've got to remember they've got effectively deep-lined pockets. Yeah. When you quote the Huff Post as a great example of anything, you've got to remember the majority of folk that made Ariana or Millions haven't seen a bean. It's finding the commercial models that have worked online. And the great one everyone uses in Scotland is the chap Pete Cashmore, who set up a site called Mashable, which is pretty much, it's a marketing social media type site. But even he had to bugger off to the States, to make the money that's made him now a CNN person. And it's that, we need to find the Scottish models, and it might be, as Paul points out, there's maybe never going to be the PowerPoint presentation that goes, this Scottish business made, an ROI of 50% through its media operations. See if it comes back with a profit of 1%. That's damn good enough, because it's a start. Yeah. And that's where we should be looking to go from. So it's not to take fault with what you're saying. What Blair says is right, but I think we need to go past looking at the guys with the deep pockets, and unless Tom Hunter wants to suddenly fund the Daily Record, in which case what would they do?
Shannon and then Stuart.